Welcome to the Genealogy Radio Show, the radio show that's keeping you in the loop. And this week's show, we look at the registration of deeds. We're looking at land and we're looking at land ownership, how it changes in the 18th century, and some of the factors that you need to look at when you're researching online. This show airs from beautiful Kilkee in Radio Corkabashkin, and we're delighted to cover quite a mixture of themes, context, history, place and space, names and spaces, and so on. The registration of deeds is quite important because in 1708, by an Irish Act of Parliament, an act for the public registering of all deeds, conveyancing and wills shall be made any honour, manors, lands, tenements and hereditaments, and the Act provided for the centralisation of the registration of deeds. And you might wonder, well, what were they doing before then? How could they prove that they owned what they owned? Well, it's a very good question because it was very much in flux. And with the Crown conquest in the 16th century, many of the listings became made then. They had castle lists, they had land lists, and they pretty much knew that the Crown owned everything. This started separating it out into different parts, and it was very much to enhance the power of the Protestant landholders as well in 1708. So landholders become less in number in 1708, and you're looking at the estates really starting to take hold. It impacts on the architecture with the move from tower houses and castles into big houses and manors and so on. And sometimes these tower houses are incorporated into the lands that they're on. You might wonder, why are they of any use? They're of huge use, these registration of deeds, because if you're looking for reasons of attainting and things that are accusing people of treason, you can find that in the registration of deeds. The earlier you go back, you see this huge land grab and you see evidence that people may be going, for example, to America because the lands have been attainted. And if you're looking for evidence of that, you can find it in the newly transcribed and memorials of the Registry of Deeds. We're very, very lucky because Family Search transcribed all these records, and now they're being translated, if you like, into not just the memorials, but a translation or a transcription of the evidence of what is on those. So think of 1708 and your Irish Act of Parliament, and this centralised registration of deeds for the sale, lease and mortgage was intended to grant greater security to property owners in the wake of the tumultuous series of land confiscations and settlements that completely transformed Irish property ownership between 1641 and 1703. So that's 60 critical years where you're looking at the Battle of the Boyne, you're looking at a huge flux in religious wars with the Stuart Wars, William of Orange, so on. The idea of a land registry had been first proposed in the 1690s, but it failed to gain sufficient political support. The Registry of Deeds legislation passage through Parliament in 1707 can be given credit to the greater legislative activity of the Irish Parliament in the years after 1703. So you're really looking a lot at the major military figures either having to go under the Treaty of Limerick to the continent on the pain of death, and suddenly you're looking at a more civil rather than militaristic type of rule being able to happen. Now, you're looking at the penal legislation relating to property. So think of the penal laws, what people can do. Can they own property? If they're Catholic, possibly not. And that's something that really comes into play with a whole load of different things happening with the leases and the land holding in Ireland in the early 1700s. It's a lot of areas where people shy away from. They're afraid of the type of dialogue that's going on with the memorialists and how tricky it is. But now that it has been transcribed for you as a volunteer project, and over 500,000 records are now available free of charge to search online, it is an essential source, especially if you have people who have emigrated at an earlier stage than the famine. And if you are looking for the movement of people internally in lands in Ireland. So it's essential that you would go through the memorials and see where the names are. And also to see, one of the things I'm looking at the moment is the change of name, the slight variant change of name, but it gives the status of the person. So I know, for example, that one of the people I'm looking for is a gentleman. So I'm after finding a surname of a person who is a gentleman in the area, which I have pinpointed as the location, looking at the hearth records, looking at the money poll taxes in the 17th century. It's possible for me to put a lead on that. And now, instead of just instinctively saying, well, I think I now have the concrete evidence that I need to be able to prove that there is actually evidence of this name being in this area, and it's giving me a load of other details as well. Because where there's land, there's rents to be paid, there's monies to be paid. This translates a lot differently in rents later on, how they're paid. For example, there's 2 days really for these rent or lease paying days, and they're usually November and around March or something like that. So you've got these specific days for paying rents. And then you have ladies' days of paying rents as well, which can be adhered to in certain places as well. So rents aren't paid weekly, they're paid twice a year. Later, this becomes an annual payment. And it's extremely important because the landlords are largely absentee. So even if they're sending agents, they're not living here all the time to be around to collect rents. And that's why they have certain days as well where they're collecting rents. These places are inaccessible. They're very difficult to get to if you're not from the area. So they centralize it that way for the collection of money. And you're really looking at a commercial activity where you're no longer being paid in hens and geese in a feudal type of society. You're being paid in money. And that leads to a different type of mercantilism and type of commercial activity that is going on. Indeed, it was possible to see the 1707 Acts, according to Patrick Walsh, who has written this excellent guide, which is available online on the Registration of Deeds, as it relates to the penal laws towards Catholics in 18th century Ireland, which had at its core the diminution of Catholic power and property. It gave greater security to the Protestant landowners, helping to secure their title to recently confiscated property. Now, even within the Protestants, there's a problem. So there is a lot of jealousy between the Anglican Protestants and the Presbyterians. The Presbyterians are deemed to be becoming too powerful. They're largely from Scotland, and they are threatening the Anglican Protestant rule. So it's not just a clear-cut job of, Catholic versus Protestant. It's actually little schisms between Protestantism as well that you have to look for when you're looking at the reason why there would be a big exodus of Presbyterians to America in the early 18th century. And they go en masse. They go collectively as families. They don't go as young men. They go with their children, their grandchildren, their wives, the whole lock, stock and barrel going, and thus setting up what becomes the beginning of settlement in the United States from Europe to some degree. Now, there were, however, other important contexts according to Patrick Walsh, and similar similarities were established in the English counties of Yorkshire and Middlesex, and the registers of Sassines in Scotland had performed similar functions going back to the 16th century. So the 18th century English county registers were primarily established to allow for greater financial lending on the security of property. And that's something we're so used to mortgages, we don't realize that there were other ways of being able to gain revenue from land. You know, mortgages are relatively new to some extent in the trading world in the 18th century and 17th century. So they weren't always there. In fact, it was illegal to lend money. It was against all religious beliefs in the earlier centuries. So how we view how land gains ground and how it's valued and what value it confers on you is a very different sense. So the scope of the Irish registry was always much broader, and it became a key mechanism for the development of a sophisticated credit market based on landed security at the very large number of mortgages registered from early 18th century onwards, and as they clearly testify. So the land becomes a way of making money. You can have land in Ireland and you can raise mortgages on it, and you can live a life in England, perhaps, that you would not be able to afford if you didn't have that line of credit. So a lot of factors going on here of how to be a gentleman. How to be a gentleman doesn't involve trade or being able to go out to work or being able to hold a job or being involved in industry. That doesn't exist. The only thing that exists is an agricultural way of prowess of making your pile, as it would be referred to. There's very interesting things happening with the memorial. The first memorial was registered in Dublin in March 1708, and quickly the Registration of Deeds established the legal landscape. There was no legal compulsion to register a deed in the foundational legislation, but they were given precedence over unregistered deeds. The growing activity moved it from a private house, moved it to the upper yard in Dublin Castle, and then to the Inns Quay a lot later on in 1805 after the Act of Union. Sometimes these statements are made like as if they happened within a few years. It's a big difference when you've got something happening in Dublin Castle for 100 years, over 100 years. That is a military stronghold, and it's protecting what's going on there. And its current site in 1830 can be where in Henrietta Lane, can be through the surviving run of memorials and transcript books. Within 10 years of the Act coming into force, 11,000 deeds had been registered. That doubled within 5 years. By 1728, only 20 years after the founding legislation, over 40,000 deeds had been registered. Over 500,000 deeds were entered into the transcript books by the end of the 18th century, and this creates an enormous and invaluable record series. It does because it tells us everything that's going on in relation to the context of the place and space. It also gives us townland indexes of 1811, so we can start understanding how the place of name really, really matters. And that's really important because even in a local context of something I would have been looking at, where I was looking for oil in fecal in the tithe allotments, and it didn't exist. And I thought, well, were they there or did they move? They never moved. What happened was the place of name was Monagila. It was a different place. It was called a different name, and it isn't really homogenized. It's homogenized with the naming pattern with the Ordnance Survey from the 1820s onwards, which doesn't just take place in 1841. So really what we start looking at is a very old world influencing a new world, especially in relation to context of how land works. The use of written deeds, usually handwritten on parchment, has a long history in Ireland going back to the medieval period. Deeds were not only drawn up to complete a transaction, but they were used to the sale of property from the 16th century, enrolled in the Court of Chancery. Unfortunately, in Ireland, these enrolled deeds, they were the ones where you'd have a sale of land and so on, were destroyed in the forecourts. And that's why the memorial of deeds, where you actually look at the creation of the deed, is really, really important for their survival, because any transactional aspect of enrolment has been destroyed in the records in 1922. The 1707 legislation stipulated that the parties of the deeds of sale, lease, and leases for over 21 years in duration, mortgages, wills, or any other form of deed used to transfer landed or built property should be registered in the Registry of Deeds. So it's not just the land title, it's the wills, it's leases, so on. The signed deeds were to be presented at the registrar's office, either by the grantee or the grantor or the grantee, and two witnesses. A memorial of the deed was lodged containing the essential details of the transaction, of the parties involved, the locational details of the property, the terms of the transaction, the length of lease, the sale, and the price. The memorial had to be dated, witnessed, and signed. Once the memorial was registered, it was given a unique number in a sequence. So, for the example, the first registered memorial in March 1708 was number 1. Importantly, the time of registration, as a registered deed had a legal precedence over an unregistered one later on. So that's why it's really important. It really gave you quite an advantage. The 18th century indexes, which act as a finding aid to the memorial, came in two forms: the grantor index or the grantee index, and so on. So what do? They're deeds which transferred freehold property, they're deeds which transferred leasehold property, they're deeds which allowed lending on property, mortgages, they're deeds which allowed charges to be imposed on property, annuities, rent charges, so on, settlements and trust. And of course, in the modern age, we're left with those deeds which allowed charges to be imposed on property, because you'd be almost led to believe that the landlords just departed in Ireland and that there was never any throwback to these days. But that's not the case. There was taxes and there was rents and there was rates paid on land that all formed a fabric of how the landlords were to be paid back and how the state was to be paid back, with the emergence of the state in 1922 and so on. So we're not away from it. We're not gone from how the money has to be paid. And people don't make the connection between this happening in the 1700s with how the deeds are registered and who owns what and what it's worth and how much is due on it, to later on in modern times with independence, with what's happening with the payment of taxes and rates and rent, what's known as the word rent. It might surprise you to realize your ancestors in the 1930s are paying rent. They have rent books. They're paying at a certain time in a village. And I'm not sure if they're paying twice a year or if they're paying once a year, but they must pay. And these taxes and that are commuted later on. So I might just ask you, PJ, what's your memory of paying the rent on the farm? Did you have to do it in your lifetime, or do you just remember your mother doing it or your grandfather?
Yes, I remember paying the rent to our rent collector. He was a Mr. Burke, and it would be twice a year. Generally, after a fair day, you paid him the rent.
Was it an onerous amount of money, or can you remember?
Oh, I can't remember, but it was something.
Would it be £10?
It could be about £12, I think it was, around £12, twice a year.
Twice a year. Okay, so that puts it into perspective to you, listeners, that this type of rent was being paid at this time. There were collectors who you paid twice a year, still harking back to the old days of how these rents were due at that time and how that really works. So it goes from the type of the nature of the instrument and so on. Now, freehold land was held in fee simple. The owner could sell, transfer, lease it, or will it as they chose. If the owner made no will, the legal heir came into possession. It is worth noting that women could not own freehold land during their marriage until the Married Women's Property Act of 1882. Furthermore, in Ireland, under the penal laws, Catholics could not purchase freehold property from between 1704 and 1782. So that's really important. That's why people would tend to keep their foot in both camps, but just how prohibited you were as a Catholic in the 18th century is really important to note. And during this period, they also had to divide up their estates among their surviving sons through the gavel-kind procedure mandated by the 1704 Act to prevent the further act of popery. So that divided, if they had 5 sons, they had to split that in 5 equal ways. They couldn't leave that to their eldest child. They couldn't really choose how the land was to be left as such. Like they had to do it a certain way because of their religion. The various means of conveying land by deed would be fiefment. A deed of fiefment had been described as the most ancient form of conveyance and formally involved the public ceremony of the livery of a session. Fiefments were by 18th century hybrid documents incorporating the terminology of the bargain and sale, and they recorded the conveyance of property using the past tense, a deed grant, in fief, alien, and confirm. You see these terms in the Encumbered Estate Act documents. You see things in fee. So you realise that land has been purchased. It's not in, it's going harking right back to medieval times. The bargain and sale, deeds of bargain and sale replaced fiefment, and bargain and sales were supposed to be enrolled under the 1536 legislation, but in practice by the 18th century, large leases superseded by deeds of lease and release. So deeds of lease and release were the common legal instrument found in the Registry of Deeds, and they included mortgage, marriage settlements, and a memorial of a deed or indenture of lease and release is only of a limited value to the researcher according to this, but I'll be honest with you, I would argue that any record we have has got some impact on place and space for the researcher, because it can place an ancestor in a place where you have no other way of proving that he or she is there. The leasing of a freehold always allows lawyers to avoid enrolling the transaction, which incurred extra fees and made the transaction public. So that's quite important of what people want to be able to do with their lands and how they want to keep their business private and so on. So this little booklet written by Dr. Patrick Walsh is real value, because it shows that transfer of leasehold property. I'll do a little blog on my website and I'll be able to, it's got a wonderful glossary of terms: assignment, a surrender, assignment of a lease, mortgages, what it means, mortgage by demise, alignment, assignment of a mortgage, and so on, grants of annuity. That would be in a form of an annual payment out of the estate. A jointure could be charged on an estate using a deed. But he draws reference to the 1709 Discovery Act, one of the most important pieces of penal legislation. Catholics could not be granted annuities for life out of landed property. So you couldn't do anything. Annuities you couldn't make any money out of the land or be granted any money out of an estate in bits and pieces. So important to look at what's happening here with the glossary, how to declaration of trust, discovery, the encumbrance, a burden or liability to which a property is subject to mortgage or an entail, an enrolment, a fee, absolute possession of freehold, estate or title, fiefment, a means of conveying property, a grant, a lease, leases for lives, a lease for a set number of named lives, usually 3. New lives could be added upon a payment of a fine. So you'd pay money to get another person added after the 3-generation lease. A 31-year lease, a lease for 31 years was the maximum lease Catholics could hold under the penal laws. Lessee, person to whom the lease was granted, lesser, person granted the lease, so on. Portions, shares of properties, quit rent, an annual grant on property formerly granted by the Crown, effectively a form of ground rent. And Peter, do you remember the term ground rent being used at all? Yeah, ground rent was something that was a term that would be used even in 20th century Ireland, and it comes from this time where it's that paying back to the Crown with the landlords all gone and so on. So the rates and the taxes and how land works in 20th century Ireland is something we'll cover in another show later on, and we're going to be doing some research on that. But just to import that to you. So very interesting little booklet, the matrix, the articles of agreements, the memorandum of agreement, the assignment, the conveyancing, so on. And what I like about this booklet, it really gives you that type of aspect, even the time. That's why the time something is registered is important in the Registry of Deeds, because it holds more important than a later deed. It's the earlier deed that might be showing the importance. And of course, Queen Anne is on the throne, so it's giving language like in the 6th reign of the reign of our sovereign lady, and so on. And you're getting a good picture of how land is suddenly changing and how powerful it is to hold land, but how powerful it is to be able to get and secure land at this time, perhaps at the expense of Catholics and Presbyterians at the time. So we're finished the show for today, and that's all for today. Thank you very much for listening. We podcast out and we also repeat the show on a Sunday. And we're delighted for your support for the Genealogy Radio Show at Radio Cork Bashkin. That's all for today. Thanks for listening.